Hi, I'm so excited to be joined today by Faith Moore. She's visited the Burn Barrel podcast before, and I'm so excited to have her because she has a new season of her podcast out. This is Storytime for Grownups, and a lot of people ask me what podcasts I listen to, I think assuming I'm going to say news because we do a lot of news on this show, and I listen to almost no news in my day-to-day life if I'm not studying for the podcast. So among the things I like to listen to history and religion. And now I listen to Storytime for Grownups, which is a literature podcast where Faith, who has a lovely voice, reads aloud classic books and explains the pieces that are hard to understand. So without further ado, tell us a little bit about the latest book you've selected. This is the first season of your podcast that I hadn't actually read the book before, so I'm really excited.
Thanks. Well, now that I feel like you've said I have a lovely voice, I feel like I have to deliver. So I'm slightly self-conscious, but thank you for that lovely introduction. Yes, this is a much lesser known book. We started with Jane Eyre, then we did Pride and Prejudice, then for Christmas we did A Christmas Carol, but now we are reading The Woman in White by Wilkie Collins, which is the kind of prime example of a genre called the sensation novel, which we don't really have anymore, but it is the precursor to the modern thriller, like the kind of psychological thriller that, you might pick up on the shelf anywhere in
Right.
a bookstore or even at the airport, right? And it's
Right. That's like
also
all my book club reads is like new
exactly.
mystery, like female-centered kind of novels.
Right. So this is the precursor to that, the sort of psychological thriller
hmm
or the mystery story, the detective story. Wilkie Collins is usually credited with writing the very first kind of police procedural, the first detective novel, which is a novel called The Moonstone, which he wrote later after The Woman in White. And there had been one other police procedural story by Edgar Allan Poe, which had come out before that, but that was a short story. And so in this book, you can really see Wilkie Collins working out how that idea works. Like there's been a crime committed and we're going to investigate and we're
Hmm.
going to follow all these clues, and he's dropping clues, but we don't know they're clues. And it's a really exciting, fun book. It's a fun book, more fun, I think, than some of the other books that we've done before, but it has ties to the Gothic, which was something we talked about a great deal when we read Jane Eyre, and it has ties to a lot of the things we've read because it's another Victorian novel, and
hmm
Wilkie Collins and Charles Dickens were very close friends and worked very closely together. So there's a lot of connections, but yes, it's a lesser known book than the others we've done so far.
Yeah, and I find it so fascinating that it's sort of a precursor to this whole police procedural movement, and that he as an author is kind of credited with founding that genre because that is a genre of story and not just book, but also like TV show in our culture that we are so steeped in, I think, without even realizing it. I even think of something like Scooby-Doo that our kids liked, the recent
Yes.
Scooby-Doo movie, where it's this like mystery solving and every episode is so predictable where you get the clues. I used to watch the show Castle that had Nathan Fillion in it, and
Yeah.
he's a writer
Mhm.
who tags along with this police department. And my husband was like, why do you like this? It's so formulaic. Every episode works the same way. It's the same every time. And I said, it's just comforting to me. I just like it. I just like,
Yeah.
Law and Order, SVU, and all these shows. So it's really interesting to see how this like developed in our way of thinking about stories.
Yeah, well, it's funny because a lot of these books, these old books, that's what we're doing on the show. First of all, we
hmm
have to do books that are old because they're in the public domain, and that gives us permission to read them aloud. But also because these are the classics that people feel like they really are supposed to be reading, but which are often really hard to get into. They're hard to
hmm
access. So we're reading these old books, and often they might seem to us to be sort of formulaic. Like you're saying, when we read Pride and Prejudice, a lot of people were like, this is just that I've seen this so many times. It's a rom-com, right? And it is a rom-com. It's just that it's the very first rom-com
Right.
ever. And it's the same with this. You're going to see things in this book that feel very familiar to you, that feel like those detective stories that you love to read or those crime dramas that you love to watch. And it's all very familiar to us, but to them, it was all new. And I think
Mhm.
that's really cool. It's cool to watch somebody creating a genre, which, as you say, has now become sort of ubiquitous. And it is comforting. And it's comforting because you kind of know, like, okay, these are the beats, these are the things that are going to happen, but how are they going to happen? How are they going to play out in this particular story? And this one, well, it's almost hard to talk about The Woman in White because anything that you say about it is going to give something away. It's that sort of
Mhm.
story, but it's got, it might feel like that formula, but it's got a lot of twists and turns.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And I don't want to give anything away, but I researched the book a little bit, just reading about the story and its influence. And one of the things that I think is interesting that's been a theme in a lot of the novels that you've read, actually, is sort of the position of women in Victorian society. And it almost seems like the more I read from this era, the more it seems like everyone was obsessed with the place of women in society and the place of women in marriage and the power that women had or didn't have over their own lives. And it's interesting because we think of the Victorians as very stuffy, but their novels and their stories are so deeply invested and deeply emotional about this question almost.
Yes, absolutely. It's a huge theme. And Wilkie Collins in particular is huge about this. And he was a very big advocate of social reform around marriage. He believed that marriage was kind of a bum deal for women. He thought that people shouldn't get married because when
Mm,
you did, the woman had to kind of give over all of her control essentially, and she had no control, and she could be controlled by the husband, and her money was then controlled by the husband, and there's a lot going on about that in his writing. But even more than that, it was a time when you know, it was the very, very, very beginning of feminism,
hmm
essentially. There were people starting to write, and even a sort of generation before, like when we were reading Pride and Prejudice, that's a generation before. But even
hmm
then, there were people writing, like Mary Wollstonecraft is the most famous one, but there were people writing at the time talking about women's rights, essentially. And should women be allowed to vote? Should they be allowed to work? Should they have equal share of property? And it was a really big question. And they were living under the rule of a female monarch
hmm
for the first time in a really long time. And Queen Victoria was this kind of huge personage who really shaped the era and the time. And she reigned for such a long time, and so many changes and so many things happened under her reign that it is a theme in a lot of these books. And it's a good thing to pull out because it's interesting to take a look at what people are saying about it. But also, it's interesting to think about the ways that modern kind of literary critics have taken that idea and tried to kind of morph it and manipulate it into a more modern version of feminism. And I think that's something that I would like to try to undo for people because I think it kind of ruins these books in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and I think it's been a thing for people for a while. I think there was an adaptation of Jane Eyre that was sort of written from the perspective of the wife in the attic who'd been locked away.
That's
And
right. Wide Sargasso Sea by
yes,
Jean Rhys, I think.
right. So, I mean, modern people have come back to these stories and looked at them a different way from our modern lens. But like you say, it's almost more interesting to listen to people from the past about how, they would have seen these issues in their society at the time because we know how we see it now and we know how we would write about it now. But, we don't have the past is a foreign country. I know that's like a cliche that people say, but people really were so different and they thought so differently. And that's one of the things I love about your podcast is that you're reading things in the original language that they were written in, not that it's a foreign language, but with all the original words, and it's not an adaptation. It's not dumbed down, and you pick apart the pieces when it gets a little tricky for us to understand as modern readers. But there was this whole debate on Twitter recently. I don't know if you saw people talking about this, but there was sort of an argument about translations of the Odyssey. And then some people started to say, well, we should really just read everything in translation. We should read Shakespeare in translation. We should have ChatGPT spit out a modern English version of all these books, and then young people can access them. They'll do so much more reading, and it's really just the story anyway. And I think something's lost, but I think a lot of people find it hard to pinpoint what it is.
It's funny because that was actually the first idea that I had when I was starting to think about starting this podcast. I was thinking about how can I make these books accessible to people, because they really are hard. And the thing that I noticed was that the people that are talking about these books, people who teach them in college classrooms, or, the academics who talk about them, because they do understand them so well and because they spend so much time thinking about them, there was this sense that I felt like was missing, which was that for some people, myself included, a lot of the time, for some people, when you open up these books and you read, you literally can't follow them. The language is too hard. And so I thought, well, how can I help people to understand the language? And the first thing I thought was, well, could I translate them? Could I think about them as if they were a foreign language, as if they were text in a foreign language, and translate them into modern English? And very quickly, I realized that that was probably the worst idea I'd ever had in my entire life. because what is lost is the world that the book exists in. What you lose when you take these books out of the language that they're written in and place them into a much more modern lingo is you lose the sense of the time and the place that is integral in a lot of ways to the story. You can't pull them out. You can adapt them, right? You can make a modern kind of retelling of the story where it takes place in the modern day and everybody is a modern person and they dress in modern clothes and they have modern problems and they go to work and all of those things. You can do that. But you can't tell the same story where they're still in Victorian England, they're still at the, in the lonely moors, in the country house, cut off from everyone else, but they're speaking in modern words. The story is gone. The ambiance is gone. The world, I always say, like, a book is a world that you get to visit and walk around in for a while and meet these people. And if you take it out of that language, then you take it out of that world. And something really important is lost. And that's why I felt like, well, no, okay, I can't do that. What I need to do is translate the things that need to be translated as I go along. As I read the real words that are there on the page, I need to just give people some handholds to some things to hold on to as they go, so they can have the language but also understand what it would mean in modern English. Yeah, and it's funny, I saw the thing about the Odyssey, but I didn't see that later part about translating things, because I think, yeah, it's an understandable impulse. It's the impulse that I had at first, but I really think it's the wrong way to go.
Right. And I think, even something like Shakespeare, it's one of those English class cliches that when the English teacher says, like, well, actually, Shakespeare's written in modern English. And because young people tend to think of that as old English, because there's all these and thous and wherefores and all the things that they think of as old English. So being told it's actually written in modern English and it's the same language as yours, and you should be able to read this. And I think most kids in English class read it in the side-by-side, the folio editions with the explanations on the one side. But that's what I think of your podcast as being like, is like that. It's like the companion piece that makes it accessible, because kids do read Shakespeare. They're able to do it, and they do get a lot out of it. And I think that Shakespeare in particular, because he was so influential on the development of modern English, and so much of our language has roots in Shakespeare, you almost have to keep the language. And I mean, Shakespeare is obviously very original, but many of his stories were lifted from Greek myth or from older stories and other places. And so I think sometimes when people go like, oh, well, Shakespeare, it's really just about the plot and the character, and it's really not. It really is the language too.
Absolutely. The whole thing is about the language. I mean, what writer wants someone to take their words and turn it into something else? I mean, we put the words on the page, those specific words for a reason.
Mm-hmm.
And those are the only building blocks you have when you're a writer. And so the words that you choose are incredibly important and they build the world and they build the characters and the way that they interact with each other. I think that a lot of times when people have that problem, they open the book and they're like, I don't understand this at all. Or like you're saying, you look at Shakespeare and there's all these strange words and they're all kind of put together in these very complicated ways. I think that people feel like, oh, well, then this just isn't for me. I just
Mm-hmm.
don't understand this, or I'm stupid. And what happens a lot of times, every time I post somewhere or I say somewhere, such and such a book is tricky. The language is tricky, but it's really good. At least one person writes in and says, no, it's not. It's not
Of
tricky.
course.
And that's the way that people are treated when they say that they don't understand a
Mm-hmm.
book, that this language is too difficult or whatever. And they think like, oh, well, then I must be an idiot. I must be really stupid. And so, if you want me to understand this, then you're going to have to put it into language that I can't understand because I'm a dope and you just told me so, and I can't
Mm-hmm.
read this, right? But in reality, it is hard. It is tricky, especially if you have no information about like historical context or what's going on. I
Right.
mean, Shakespeare is full of like references to what's going on at the time or relationships between various historical figures and things. And if you don't know those things, or if you don't know what the deal is with Victorian England or, Regency life with all the balls and the tea parties and things like that, if you don't know any of that, then of course you can't read this. It's not that you're stupid. It's just that you don't have the information that you need. You don't have the tools at your disposal that you need. And so I think it's easy to say like, oh yeah, well, it's just old language and I don't understand this old language. Who would? So let's turn it into modern language. But really, should we erase the past? Should we erase history? Like, no,
Mm-hmm.
we should learn to understand it. And in order to learn to understand it, we have to admit that we don't. And I think
Right.
that's okay. I think you should admit that you don't. And I think then you should seek out some way to figure it out.
Mm-hmm. And I'm so glad because a lot of these books aren't taught in school, or at least aren't taught anymore in school.
Yeah.
I think Pride and Prejudice is the only one you've done so far that I actually read as a school book in an English class. And, you know, I think that these challenges do come across as too intimidating to teachers in this day and age, where they say, like, I can't get the kids to be interested in this. I can't get them to read this. They don't like it. They don't understand it. We need to read modern books that are accessible to their experiences, or we just need to, we need to read adapted versions that have essentially a Cliff Notes version of the book. And then I think like, oh, the kids must be so bored in English class. They never read anything good. And I think you saw, we had our daughter this year in English class first read All Quiet on the Western Front, which I think is the first, what I would consider like real novel that they've read in school.
Yeah.
And they're doing a Midsummer Night's Dream later in the year, too. And the school sent home a whole big apology, like, this has a lot of graphic imagery. This book is about war. We're skipping certain passages. Don't see the movie. It's way too scary. Like, on and on. And I'm like, imagine if you're a kid and, like, they never read you anything for fear of how scary or dangerous it's going to be. I mean, like, do they know what kids watch on TV or in the movie theater now?
Yeah, exactly. First of all, your dramatic reading of that letter was one of my favorite things that I've seen in a while. That was fantastic. But right. I mean, why choose, first of all, why choose that book if you're so afraid that it's going to harm the children? Pick something else. There is an enormous variety of wonderful classic literature out there, or pick this book because there's nothing wrong with teaching it to children.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that we have a mentality right now in our culture that these books, when a book becomes a classic for whatever reason, when it's placed into the bucket of classic literature, then it becomes something that must be dissected. It must be taken apart and analyzed, and we have to find all the hidden meanings and all the symbolism and what does this mean and what does that mean. And we have forgotten that these stories are just stories. And the point of them is a story. In the same way as the novel that you pick up in order to, entertain yourself on the airplane or whatever it is, that is a story that sweeps you away. These books are also stories that sweep us away, which is why they are classics. They have stood the test of time because they have some kind of universal appeal. And the appeal is not whatever little detail you picked up and its significance to whatever other thing you think its significance to. Its appeal is the story that it holds within it. And I think when you get into that kind of English teacher mentality, and then you start thinking about, well, how am I going to get these kids to understand the significance of the Red Room in Jane Eyre? Or, how am I going to get these kids to understand, the significance of birds or whatever? When you start thinking about that, then it's like, yeah, we might as well read something we pulled off the young adult shelf at Barnes and
Mm-hmm.
Noble. When you start thinking about them as, well, this is a love story. This is a love story between a dark, brooding man and this poor, plain governess. Like, what 14-year-old doesn't want to read that?
Right.
And I think that's what we've lost sight of. And that's why we're sort of picking and choosing these kind of weird selections, trying to find something that can grab these kids. We're not doing them the service of saying, this is a great story. This is Pride and Prejudice. It's really funny. It's really, really funny. You're going to laugh out loud. And it's a rom-com in the same way that, your rom-com, that Mean Girls or whatever it is that you
Right.
watch, on TV or on the movies. It's a rom-com. Let's read it like that. Because who wouldn't want to read a rom-com that's laugh out loud funny?
Right. And it's such a great point because we think, sometimes we know better than everyone who came before us. That they liked this book, like, oh, my kid won't read that. I'm just going to get them a graphic novel of whatever the latest story is off the shelf, or something that's adapted from a movie that my kid liked to watch, or whatever it is. And like you say, the classics are classics for a reason. And it's not because, there was a bunch of analysis that people could do on them at the time. It
That's
was because
right.
people really
Exactly.
liked them.
Yes, that's right. And I also think, and this is, I think, one of my more unpopular opinions, but I also think that we give books to kids too early. I
Mm,
think I think that why I don't know why we give these really weighty books. I mean, some books should be given to kids at the right time, but
mm-hmm,
I don't know why we give these really weighty books about really adult concerns, like really adult
mm-hmm,
things to little kids, like 12, 13-year-old kids. I don't, I think we should wait. I think we should wait until, because the reason we give them to them is because maybe we can teach them to analyze them. But I want them to enjoy them. I want them to love them. And I say this as someone who was given a lot of books too early and had to go back. Because what happens is you read them, you don't understand them. You can't really identify with the characters because you're 12 and these
mm-hmm.
characters are having really grown up concerns, right? And then you think, well, I hate that book. I
Right.
hate Jane Eyre. I hate Pride and Prejudice. And so you run the risk of never picking it up again because you remember that you hate it. You might not remember why, but you
Mm-hmm.
remember that you hate it. And now that has been done to you forever, and you're going to have to come back and make an effort to read it again if you want to. And so I think that there are books that are classics that kids should read. I think once you get into high school, you can read some of these books. I mean, I fell in love with Jane Eyre when I was 14 or so. So
Mm-hmm.
it's not like we need to wait until we're 30 or something like that. But I do think, you know, Roald Dahl is a classic. He's
Mm-hmm.
a classic writer. I think we can give him to kids.
Even L.
You know,
Frank Baum too, I
yep,
think.
the Narnia books,
Hmm.
right? There are all of these books that are classics and filled with all kinds of beautiful themes and imagery and things to talk about, really juicy things to dive into in an English class and talk about that aren't these kind of really inaccessible to children books. And I think that's part of the problem too, is that we're asking children to read books for adults because we've forgotten that these books are just stories. We
Hmm.
wouldn't hand a 10-year-old Stephen King.
Right.
We would know that that wasn't right. And or we wouldn't hand them, I mean, anything, any whatever books are out there in the world right now that people are reading, the most
Right.
popular books, we wouldn't hand them to children if they're not children's books. And so I think that's part of the problem too, is people are like, well, I don't get this and it's boring and I hate it and I'm never going to pick it up again because they weren't ready for it.
And I think there is really a dearth of, um, you know, modern children's books that are really written for children and not
Yeah.
through an adult lens. So many of them feel the need to like pack in these issues about, parents getting divorced or dying or,
Yeah.
all kinds of like crazy things that they need to force into these stories that could just be children's story. I mean, there's some really talented writers out there. And I think the second children become old enough that the school perceives they're ready to move beyond like Harry Potter, they want to fit books with adult issues in for kids. And I think that's something that maybe more classic children's writers were a little more free of this presumption that, they had to force adult issues or themes, things your guidance counselor would want to talk about into a book that's for kids to just read.
Yeah. That's a really good point. And I think another thing that's occurring to me as you're talking is that something that you also need, like we were just talking about a few minutes ago, is the historical context that a lot of these books, you need them, right? They
Hmm.
take place in the Victorian era, or they take place during the Civil War, or during World War One, or whatever it is, you need that. And a lot of the classic children's books that we might pick up also take place in those time periods or in that world.
Hmm.
And it could help you to have some of the background information that you would need when you get there. I mean, I'm thinking about, like The Secret Garden or A Little Princess, for example,
Right.
are books that could introduce you to kind of Victorian England at a time that then when you go on to read Jane Eyre or The Woman in White or whatever, that could help you, or books that are written in wartime, or books that, for example, like World War II. I know we were talking about World War One, but World War II, the Narnia books take place during World War II, and you could
Hmm.
get that information out of them and take that with you to other books later on. And so I think we're skipping that step a lot of the time. And then we're asking these kids to enter these worlds with adult concerns at a time in a time period they know nothing about, in a place they know nothing about. And it's kind of like, yeah, of course they don't like them. And of course they want something to grab onto, some modern lens to look at the thing through because they have no footholds.
Right. We put this stuff forward to them and it's very mysterious. And I've
Yeah.
been so excited to share this podcast with my daughter because it makes these books accessible to her in a way that's very tough and is very tough coming from English classes where they read everything in adaptation or everything that was written in the last 20 years or so, that I can't just hand her Jane Eyre. Like, I was the type of kid that I would sit there and read Jane Eyre because I was
Mhm.
weird. And like, there's pictures of me like at recess in middle school reading, and my kids are like, "Why were you
Well,
reading
we would
during
have been
recess?
friends.
What
That's
was
nice.
wrong with you?"
Yes.
But she's not the type of person that I can just hand her Jane Eyre and she's off to the races and can go. But it's great to have that because it is such a great story and there's so much to connect with, even from a modern audience as a teenager that you can relate to and see yourself in and think about. And, you lose something if you have no way to access these works. So I'm very excited to keep getting into Into the Woman in White with you, Faith, and I'm
Thank
excited
you.
to see where the story takes me. I've tried not to spoil it too much. I've like looked a little bit online, but I'm trying to be kind of good.
Yeah, you have to be good. People keep writing me and say, I can't do it. I have to read ahead. I'm like, no, no, stay with it because it's so fun to let it unfold as it goes along. And there's so many twists and turns. It's great.
So I encourage everyone else who's interested in classic literature like I am and who wants a break from politics and modern times and all that that entails to check out Storytime for Grownups with Faith Moore. She's a great reader aloud of books, and we love having her on the show anytime. Obviously, you're welcome back, and hopefully we will talk to you again soon when you make your next selection too. So thank you
Well,
so
thank
much,
you.
Faith.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure to come on here. Thank you so much.